So this is our, I think, our third week reading Simondon's Individuation in the Light of Notions of Form and Information. So we're still in the introduction. We just finished the foreword last time and just started the introduction. So we're at page 4 of the introduction. We've just seen his initial criticisms of the hylomorphic schema and the atomistic or substantialist schema. So these two alternate modes of understanding what individuation is, and both of them, or each of them, is insufficient because they presuppose a principle of individuation which precedes the individuation process itself. And that principle is already something of the nature of an individual. So it's presupposing what it's supposed to explain. So that's his sort of general criticism of those two modes of explanation of individuation. And then he has more detailed criticisms of each of them as well that we'll get to as we continue through the book. So I can start. Oh, I just skipped ahead. Sorry, just a second. Let me find the page again. Okay, I'll start from the first full paragraph on page 4. I'm not sure exactly where we got to, but we can start from there and continue, and then other people can take up the reading. The word ontogenesis takes on its full meaning if, instead of granting it the restricted and derived sense of the individual's genesis, in opposition to a vaster genesis, for example, that of the species, it is made to designate the nature of beings becoming, that through which the being becomes insofar as it is, qua being. It is possible that the opposition of being and becoming may be valid only within a certain doctrine that supposes that the very model of being is substance. But it is also possible to suppose that becoming is a dimension of the being and corresponds to the being's capacity to phase shift with respect to itself, to resolve itself by phase shifting. Pre-individual being is being in which no phase exists. The being in which an individuation is completed is that in which a resolution appears through the division of the being into phases, i.e. becoming. Becoming is not a framework in which the being exists. It is the being's dimension, the mode of resolution of an incompatibility that is rich in potentials. Individuation, lost the page again, just a sec. Individuation corresponds to the appearance of phases in the being that are the phases of the being. It is not an isolated consequence deposited on the edge of becoming, but this very operation as it is undergoing completion. Individuation can only be understood on the basis of this initial and homogeneous supersaturation of the being without becoming that afterwards is structured and becomes, making the individual and milieu appear according to becoming, which is a resolution of the initial tensions and a conservation of these tensions as a structure. In a certain sense, it can be said that the sole principle based on which we can be guided is that of the conservation of being through becoming. This conservation exists throughout the exchanges between structure and operation, proceeding by way of quantum leaps via successive equilibria. In order to think individuation, we must consider being not as a substance or matter or form, but as a tense, supersaturated system above the level of unity, as not merely consisting in itself and as unable to be thought adequately by means of the principle of the excluded middle. The concrete being or complete being, i.e. pre-individual being, is a being that is more than a unity. Unity, which is characteristic of the individuated being, and identity, which authorizes the usage of the principle of the excluded middle, do not apply to pre-individual being, which explains why the world cannot be recomposed after the fact with monads, even by adding other principles like sufficient reason in order to organize these monads into a universe. Unity and identity merely apply to one of the phases of being, posterior to the operation of individuation. These notions cannot help us discover the principle of individuation. They do not apply to ontogenesis understood in the full sense of the term, i.e. to the becoming of the being, qua being, which splits and phase shifts while individuating. So there's a question here about the excluded middle. I don't think that's in particular a reference to the wave-particle dichotomy within quantum mechanics or complementarity. But yes, I think Elias is right that it's a reference to informal logic. So this is one of the principles that governs classical logic. So a proposition, so a proposition is either true or not true, or of any individual. It's either the individual either possesses a property or doesn't possess it. So A is B or A is not B. Different formulations of the same principle. But under this under this principle of classical logic, there's only the two options of true or not true, or possessing a property or not possessing the property. And yes, as Ion pointed out, there are alternate systems of logic in which the law of excluded middle does not hold, so that for example, in intuitionistic logic, you can't infer from not A to A. So the double negation elimination doesn't hold in intuitionistic logic. So so that's a consequence of the fact that there's law of excluded middle doesn't hold. So in this passage, he's so more generally, he's talking about the concept of ontogenesis. Here, he's making use of it in an alternate meaning compared to its traditional use. So normally, ontogenesis is opposed to phylogenesis. So phylogenesis would be the development of the species over history, and then ontogenesis would be the development of an individual, a member of the species. But here, Simondon wants to use the term ontogenesis to mean of becoming, of being. So in the sense of an entity insofar that it has a becoming as part of that being. And so this has to do with this notion of the phase shift within being. So pre-individual being that contains these tensions undergoes the phase shift, this splitting operation in which the individual appears as a structure that corresponds to that tension. And the individual is a product of this individuation process, but it's not an exhaustive product. So there's always the milieu, the accompanying surrounding environment, which is not itself individuated. So there's always something pre-individual that remains after the process of individuation. All right, we can go on to the next bit if someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I got it. Starting at individuation. Oh no, unity. Right.
No, right. Individuation has not been able.
Oh, okay, yeah, cool. Individuation has not been able to be adequately thought and described because only a single form of equilibrium was known, namely stable equilibrium. What was unknown was precisely metastable equilibrium. Being was implicitly supposed in a state of stable equilibrium. However, stable equilibrium excludes becoming because it corresponds to the lowest level of potential energy possible. A stable equilibrium is achieved in a system when all possible transformations have occurred and no propulsive forces remain. All potentials have been actualized, and systems that have succumbed to their lowest energetic levels cannot transform again. The ancients only knew stability and instability, rest and movement, but they did not know metastability clearly and objectively. In order to define metastability, it is necessary to establish the notion of the potential energy of a system, the notion of order, and the notion of the increase of entropy. It is therefore possible to define this metastable state of being, which is quite different from the stable equilibrium and rest, and which the ancients couldn't establish in their search for the principle of individuation because they lacked a clear physical paradigm that could clarify its utilization. Consequently, we will begin by attempting to present physical individuation as a case of the resolution of a metastable system on the basis of a system state, like that of supercooling or supersaturation involving the genesis of crystals. Examples of the process of crystallization have been carefully researched and can certainly serve as paradigms in other domains, but crystallization does not exhaust the reality of physical individuation. Thus, we must consider if we can interpret certain aspects of microphysics by means of this notion of the becoming of being in a metastable state, particularly the nature of the complementary of the concepts utilized in microphysics as pairs, wave corpuscle, matter, and energy. Perhaps this duality stems from the fact that scientific conceptualism supposes the existence of a real that consists of terms between which there are relations, insofar as terms are not modified by relations in their internal structure.
So here he introduces this key notion of metastability, which we discussed, I think, when we were talking about the foreword, but just as a reminder, or for those who weren't here, so metastability in opposition to stability. Metastability is a relative equilibrium, or a temporary equilibrium in which potentials for further transformation still exist. So it's a system. System is in a metastable state when it is in equilibrium, but still maintains potentials for further transformation, rather than being in a stable equilibrium when it's in its lowest state of energy and no longer has any potentials for further transformation. So this notion of metastability is one of the key notions of Simondon's whole philosophical project. And it's so as he points out here in this passage, this is a key notion that was missing in ancient philosophy in order for it to adequately understand individuation. They were unable to understand ontogenesis, or the process of individuation, because they had no grasp of the concept of metastability. And so this concept is borrowed from physical sciences as a paradigm, and then he takes the example of the crystallization as this is a key example, and he's going to come back to this in the first chapter in more detail. But the example is that in a supersaturated solution, there's a relative equilibrium or a metastable state, which then can undergo transformation into a crystal, and then that, as someone was asking in the chat there, if that would be a stable equilibrium, and yes, that's my understanding of that. The crystal, once it's formed, it would be in a stable equilibrium state. So the solution is metastable, and then a transformation comes about, and then the crystal itself doesn't have the potential to undergo further transformation. And then the last little bit in this paragraph is he mentions again this inability of conceptual thinking to grasp what is real in the pre-individual in what is real. So the fact that in subatomic or in microphysics we have to use these complementary notions like wave and particle is a result of the fact that we're dealing with the pre-individual, and so we have to use complementary concepts because an individual concept is not capable of grasping the real. And so we'll see further in this introduction some of his ideas, epistemological notions, but he's going to characterize the form of thinking that is capable of grasping the pre-individual as transductive thinking. So it's thinking that operates in the same way as the crystallization process, and we'll see a little bit more what that means later on. And then the last thing that I'll mention is this notion of relations. So we talked about this as well in the when we were talking about the foreword, but Simondon wants to limit the term relation to what has been called in the philosophical tradition internal relations, so relations that are constitutive of the being of the terms related. So he's opposing here the concept of external relations. So these would be relations in which the terms pre-exist the relation, and the relation is external to the being of those terms. So that's a notion that he sees as not capable of grasping reality, or in particular the process of individuation. And so we need to pass to the more concrete notion of internal relations, which is the one that he wants to work with. And yeah, people can feel free to ask questions or make comments on the voice chat if they want as well, or in the chat, and I'll try to answer some of the questions or read in the comments and so on. But yeah, so there was a comment or a question or comment, I'm not sure exactly, from Angus here. So the individual as it has been thought in Western metaphysics is dead in a sense because it isn't thought as a partial resolution of the ongoing process. Yeah, I think that would be accurate. So the different notions of individuality that have been prevalent in the Western philosophical tradition that Simondon deals with are the atomistic one and the hylomorphic one, and in each case, the individual there's no understanding of the process of individuation in either of these traditions or either of these frameworks. So the individual is a result of some sort of operation of individuation, but that individuation operation itself is not grasped in that theory. So in the atomistic theory, we have the atoms are the real individuals, or the ultimate individuals, and their individuation is not explained. It's taken as an unexplained explainer. And then what is explained is the composite bodies that are made up of atoms. Their individuation is a result of the combination of atoms. And then in the hylomorphic theory, we have matter and form come together, and then there's different variations within that tradition as to which side accounts for the individuation, whether it's the matter that individuates the form or vice versa. But in either case, the actual taking on of form, the process through which the form comes to be imposed on the matter, is not itself explained.
I think what's so interesting too that we've talked about in other sessions is like how he says that even this way of talking about individuation that I think, I don't know if it's in the introduction or a bit later, where he says you can't simply know individuation in the way that we tend to think about knowing other things, that, you know, in order to talk about or even think transduction, it's like an operation of individuation to even think in that way. And I think that it is quite complex, but it's interesting to connect to these questions of that, what Angus is saying about the individual in Western metaphysics and all these things, because he's trying to transcend all these problems of formal logic and terms and how the terms themselves are the byproducts of this individuation of knowledge, but it's as though we're starting at the end of it rather than thinking through the genesis of it in that intuitive and I guess like sort of scientific way. But it's really, I'll paste some quotes in the chat, but I really like these sections early on when he's talking about the transductive operation of knowledge is kind of part and parcel with this whole project.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit later in the introduction, but so he says knowledge of transduction it comes about through a transduction in knowledge. So there's a process of individuation within our knowledge, which is how we come to know a process of individuation in things. So there's an analogy between the transductive process in things and then the transductive process in our knowledge. Right, and there's a comment here from Micha, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but yes, so crystals form into a set pattern depending on what they're made of, but they can continue to grow with their boundaries as long as material is available to settle on it. Yes, so again, we'll see more on the crystallization example in the first chapter after we get through the introduction. So he talks about the way that the structure of the crystal depends on the chemical composition of the solution that's crystallizing. And there are certain chemicals that can crystallize in different forms, and so that's it will depend on which form crystallizes first, for example. And so at the boundaries, the crystal is still undergoing a process of individuation, but within the crystal itself, it's dead in the sense that it's already undergone its transformation, and it no longer has potentials for more transformation.
So this quote we just heard, it does remind me of dissipative structures, something that Ilya Prigogine was talking about. Is this the same thing when Simondon is talking about this process of crystallization and some sort of a self-organizing structure that takes out energy from its surroundings to uphold its own structure, so to speak, and expand in this way with so to say, a neck entropic principle?
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked at Prigogine and the dissipative structures stuff, but my understanding is that it's a little bit different in the sense that dissipative structures are structures that it's a process structure, so you have like a chemical reaction that feeds back into itself, or that catalyzes itself, and so as long as you have an open system with a input of energy or input of more chemicals, it's a sort of a circular process that can continue forever. Whereas here, the crystal is a structure that arises out of the initial state, but it's not itself a process, and so the interior of the crystal is anterior, as Angus pointed out, that Simondon is ultimately going to derive the concept of time from that process of individuation. So the interior of the crystal is a product, and rather than something that is part of a process, and it's only at the edge of the crystal, at the limits, that it's still continuing the process of individuation. So I think it's different in that sense, a process versus a product. And yes, so as Alyosha put it in the chat, the potentials remain latent at the limits. So there's an ongoing process of individuation at the limits of the crystal, and he's going to talk about the concept of modulation, and the way that there's a modulation of energy at the limit of the crystal. We'll see that a little bit later on. And yes, so this is specifically talking about the physical individuation process, and we won't get to the vital individuation, the individuation of a living being until chapter 2, I believe, but it's a little ways off.
Yet we can also suppose that reality is initially in itself similar to the supersaturated solution, and even more so in the pre-individual regime, more than unity and more than identity, and that it is capable of manifesting as wave or corpuscle, matter or energy, because every operation and every relation within an operation is an individuation that splits and phase shifts pre-individual being, all while correlating the extreme values and orders of magnitude, which are initially without mediation. Complementarity would then be the epistemological reverberation of the initial and original metastability of the real. Because they are theories of identity, neither mechanism nor energeticism fully account for reality. In addition to the theory of corpuscles, the theory of fields and the theory of the interaction between fields and corpuscles are still partially dualistic, but lean toward a theory of the pre-individual. By way of another path, the theory of quanta grasps this regime of the pre-individual that surpasses unity. An exchange of energy occurs through elementary quantities, as if there were an individuation of energy in the relation between particles, whereby particles can somewhat be considered as physical individuals. Perhaps it would be in this sense that we could see the convergence of these two new theories, that of quanta and that of wave mechanics, which to this very day have remained impenetrable to one another. They could be envisioned as two ways of expressing the pre-individual through the different manifestations in which it intervenes as pre-individual. Below the continuous and the discontinuous, there is the quantic and the metastable complementary, the more than unity, which is the true pre-individual. The necessity of correcting and pairing basic concepts in physics perhaps translates the fact that concepts are adequate only to individuated reality and not to pre-individual reality.
So here, this is the point that we discussed a little in the previous paragraph, this notion that the necessity for using complementary concepts is a result of the inadequacy of concepts to grasp the pre-individual. So when we get to the microphysical realm, when we're dealing with the microphysical realm, and we sort of come in contact with the pre-individual, then we need to use these, if we try to think in concepts in this particular sense in which Simondon is using the term concept, then we end up having to use paired concepts that are complementary to each other. So he's going to suggest that transductive thinking is capable of knowing the pre-individual in the way that conceptual thinking is not.
I do like this statement at the end here when he says, below the continuous and the discontinuous, there is the quantic and metastable complementary, more than unity, which is the true pre-individual. Which I mean, it just feels like another way of restating what he's been saying all along about the problems with, the like law of the excluded middle type approach to already individuated concepts or individuals, that there's something that what's the pre-individual isn't simply, you don't want to fall into another way of talking about it as though it's a monad, that it has to be, I think he calls it somewhere a transductive unity or something rather than just a unity, that it itself is composed of like heterogeneous dimensions of being or of becoming, I guess you might say, that predate, if it predates or is anterior to phases, then I don't know, I don't have a coherent point here. I like where he's going with that.
Yeah, you called back to the another portion that we didn't really comment on, which is that when he mentions the monads and trying to reconstitute the world with monads, and the way that even when you add something like the principle of sufficient reason, which is supposed to link the monads into a world, there's still they still remain isolated from each other, and so that is sort of paradigmatic for Simondon of the process or of the attempts within philosophy to try to reconstitute or recapture what is lost when you start from the individual already individuated. So if you start from these already individuated individuals, then their integration or connection to each other, it becomes impossible to understand, rather than when you start from the pre-individual, which undergoes the process of individuation, then the integration of an individual and its milieu sort of follows naturally.
We would then understand the paradigmatic value of the study of the genesis of crystals as a process of individuation. This would allow us to grasp on the macrophysical scale a phenomenon that depends on system states which belong to the microphysical domain and which are molecular, not molar. We would grasp activity that is at the limit of the crystal and its formation. Such an individuation is not the encounter of a preliminary form and a preliminary matter existing as previously constituted separate terms, but a resolution emerging within a metastable system rich in potentials. Form, matter, and energy pre-exist in the system. Neither form nor matter is sufficient. The veritable principle of individuation is mediation, which generally supposes an original duality of orders of magnitude and an initial absence of interactive communication between them, and then a communication between orders of magnitude and stabilization. While a potential energy, the condition of a superior order of magnitude, is actualized, a matter is organized and divided, the condition of an inferior order of magnitude, into structured individuals on an intermediate order of magnitude that develops through an intermediate process of amplification. What leads to and founds crystallization it is the energetic regime of the metastable system. But the crystal's form expresses certain molecular or atomic characteristics of the constituting chemical species.
Right. Before we sort of discuss this passage, maybe there's one point of translation that I would mention, is so in the middle paragraph, the second one that we just read, so there's a series of reflexive verbs here, which he translates as passives in English. So we could instead read it, we could instead translate them as reflexive in English. So we could say, at the same time as a potential energy condition of a superior order of magnitude actualizes itself, rather than is actualized. So actualizes itself, a matter organizes itself and distributes itself, condition of a inferior order of magnitude into structured individuals at a intermediate order of magnitude, and developing itself through a mediate process of amplification. So that's an alternate possibility of translation. I think we can sort of read both translations into the text. There's a self-actualization, self-structuring process going on at the same time.
Can I ask a question about this sentence here? When he's saying the potential energy, the condition of a superior order of magnitude. So this is the first time I'm coming across him phrasing it this way. Usually, so far, it seems like potentials, he's talked about them as sort of just part of the metastable system state or whatever of being in excess of itself more than a unity in pre-individual dephased or pre-dephasing, I guess, like pre-phased being or whatever. But here, this idea of potential energy is specifically the condition of a superior order of magnitude, and then what is organized and divided is the inferior one. So if we were thinking of the example of the plant or really anything else, is it that, because when he talks about the atomism and stuff like that, I think in the, was it Gary or whoever wrote the foreword was talking about how is it the atomistic or the substantialist account, there's this idea like how do you explain certain kinds of change? It's like, well, when there's a greater force, it basically somehow displaces this other thing and changes the state of the atoms, which obviously is insufficient in Simondon's account. But I guess my question is that a way of like retooling it in a sense of does it fit with the idea of states of tension in that the superior order of magnitude reconciling with the tensions between itself and the lower order of magnitude through the mediate process of that individuation? I'm imagining almost like tectonic plates forming mountains or something like that. Is that the right direction? Is that where he's going with that?
I think the tectonic plates example is a little bit misleading in the sense that the plates already pre-exist the formation of the mountains. So the plates are already individuated, and then the mountain is formed through the process of the plates interacting with each other. So as I understand this bit or this notion here that he's expressing, is that so in the crystallization example, you have a supersaturated solution. The potential energy is a property of the system as a whole. It's not localized in any sense. It's a property of the whole solution, the whole system. And then it's the properties of the whole system, the potential energy distributed across the whole system that is going to lead, as he puts it, or underlie the process of individuation. But what is going to generate the structure is the smaller order or the inferior order of magnitude, the atomic structure or molecular structure of the chemical in the solution. So there's the interaction between this inferior order of magnitude, the atomic and molecular level, and then the superior order of magnitude, which is the property of the system as a whole. And they interact to form this individual at the mediate order of magnitude or mediate scale, the crystal on the order of centimeters in that range of size. So that's how I understand this example. So the formation of the individual is a kind of mediation between the properties of the system as a whole and the atomic and molecular properties of the chemicals that make up the solution.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think you're right that my example was kind of almost falling into the hylomorphic trap. In my head, I still kind of thought, I think you could probably reconcile it with the idea of milieu and like the Earth itself and larger metastable systems. But I think it makes sense what you said, that the superior order is the metastable system itself, and the inferior order, in a sense, is these individuals that are produced but aren't the complete result of the individuation process. So thanks.
And so this notion of orders of magnitude is an important one as well. And there's that example that we saw in, I think it was cited in the foreword, but we'll see it later on in the introduction. But the example of the plant as the mediate order of magnitude, which integrates the cosmic order of magnitude by absorbing solar energy with the microphysical level order of magnitude. In the cellular processes that it undergoes. So there's any type of individuation is a mediation between a superior and an inferior order of magnitude. So a greater system and a smaller system in integrating the two or mediating the disjunction between the two. Yeah, I think, Alyosha, I think you're right that we could try to take the whole Earth's crust as a metastable system and look at the way that that structures emerge out of the Earth's crust. So there would be interactions between the potential energy of the system as a whole, of the Earth's crust as a whole, or whole, continental plates or something like that. And then the chemical structure of the various materials that make up the Earth's crust, and the way that those processes would interact with each other and produce at a mediate level some sort of like geological formations would be the individuals that are formed out of the interaction of those two orders of magnitude. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph if someone else would like to read.
In the domain of the living, the notion of metastability can also be used to characterize individuation, but individuation no longer occurs in a strictly instantaneous, quantum, abrupt, and definitive way, as in the physical domain, which leaves in its wake a duality of the milieu and the individual, insofar as the milieu has been robbed of the individual, because the former and the latter no longer coincide, and insofar as the individual has lost the dimension of the milieu. Such an individuation also undoubtedly exists for the living being as an absolute origin, but it is doubled by an ongoing individuation, which is life itself, according to the fundamental mode of becoming. The living being conserves within itself an ongoing activity of individuation. It is not merely a result of individuation, like the crystal or molecule, but a theater of individuation. Furthermore, unlike that of the physical individual, the whole activity of the living being is not concentrated at its limit. In the living being, there is a more complete regime of internal resonance that requires ongoing communication and that maintains a metastability, which is a condition of life. This is not the only characteristic of the living being, and the living being cannot be compared to an automaton that would maintain a certain number of equilibria, or would seek compatibilities among several requirements based on a formula of a complex equilibrium composed of simpler equilibria. The living being is also a being that results from an initial individuation and amplifies this individuation, which is something that is not done by the technical object to which cybernetic mechanism would want to functionally compare it. In the living being, there is an individuation by the individual, and not merely an operation resulting from an individuation completed in a single stroke, as though it were a fabrication. The living being resolves problems, not just by adapting, i.e. by modifying its relation to the milieu, like a machine is capable of doing, but by modifying itself, by inventing new internal structures, and by completely introducing itself into the axiomatic of vital problems. The living individual is a system of individuation, an individuating system, and a system that is in the midst of undergoing the process of individuating. Internal resonance and the translation of self-relation into information takes place in this system of the living being. In the physical domain, internal resonance characterizes the limit of the individual in the midst of undergoing the process of individuating. In the living domain, internal resonance becomes the criterion of the whole individual qua individual. There is internal resonance in the system of the individual, and not merely in what the individual forms with its milieu. Unlike that of the crystal, the organism's internal structure does not merely result from the activity that is accomplished and from the modulation that takes place at the limit between the domain of interiority and the domain of exteriority. Perpetually centered outside itself, perpetually peripheral relative to itself, and active at the limit of its domain, the physical individual has no veritable interiority. On the contrary, the living individual has a veritable interiority because individuation takes place from within. Inside the living individual, the interior is also constitutive, whereas in the physical individual, only the limit is constitutive, and what is topologically interior is genetically anterior. The living individual is contemporaneous with itself in all its elements, which is not the case for the physical individual, for the latter includes a past that is radically past, even when it is still in the process of growing. At the interior of itself, the living being is a mode of informative communication. It is a system within a system, involving within itself a mediation between two orders of magnitude.
One thing I would just to say to the last sentence, he wrote not mode of informative communication, but node.
No, so in French it's ne. It could be a knot of information. That would be another translation. So yeah, there was a question in the chat about the notion of homeostasis that is being discussed here. So this is a reference to the cybernetic theory of I think it's William Ashby, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure about his first name, but Ashby, he developed these machines that were capable of maintaining themselves in a certain state. I mean, the simplest example would be a thermostat connected to a furnace. So you set the thermostat at a certain temperature. If the temperature goes below that, then the furnace turns on, which increases the temperature back to the set state. And so the system as a whole, the thermostat furnace system, is capable of maintaining a certain state. And then so Ashby developed other machines that were capable of doing this same type of thing, which he called homeostats. So the idea, and his were more complex than just the thermostat furnace system, but the idea in general was to try to model life as a process of maintaining a certain equilibrium state. And Simondon is criticizing that notion of life or of the living, and so he argues that that notion depicts living beings as being individuated sort of once and for all, in the same way that physical individuals are. Whereas for him, the living being is constantly undergoing a process of individuation, and it individuates itself. So here again, we have one of these reflexive verbs that is translated just as a passive, but so a line that's emphasized here. He says, the living individual is a system of individuation, an individuating system, and a system individuating itself. That would be the alternate translation. So the living individual not only undergoes individuation, it's not just a product of individuation, it's also the agent of individuation. It individuates itself. And we'll see more on what that means in particular, but it has to do with resolution of problems. So living beings are able to problem solve both in their structure and in their behavior. They solve problems. What else was I going to say? Oh yes, there was a question about the notion of quantum. I think yes, I think he is using it here in this paragraph to mean discrete. So as opposed to continuous. So yeah, it's read towards the beginning of the paragraph that we just read. So individuation no longer occurs as in the physical domain in a strictly instantaneous. It actually says quantic, not quantum in French, but it's not a big deal. Quantic, abrupt, and definitive way. So yeah, it's I think it's just a synonym for discrete in that context.
So can I just ask with the example of the homeostat? So is it that with a machine like that it is essentially, although it appears to be adaptive, it's like you're saying, it's not going through the continually like iterative adaptive individuation happening within the living being, because it's still essentially, assuming we're excluding, I guess, like AI and stuff here, which I don't know how you address that within Simone, but like, you know, deep mind type stuff, but within just like a more simple machine like this, it's always kind of you know, it's like a Rube Goldberg machine or something that's set into motion, and then it performs these tasks, but it's still kind of, destructuration kind of happens insofar as how it's built, I guess, or how it's initially built, and it doesn't then change its structuration so much as it might break down or something like that. Does that track?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the machine, the homeostat, no matter how complex it is, it's something that's fabricated at a certain point with certain possibilities of action. So it's capable of maintaining a certain state of, whether it's temperature or orientation towards light or whatever it's set up to do. It will maintain an equilibrium state with respect to that property of the environment. But it's not capable of, say, changing its structure to orient itself away from light rather than towards light or something like that. So it's adaptive in the sense that it can respond to certain properties of the environment to maintain a certain state, but it's not capable of adapting its own structure. And yeah, so it would be an interesting question. It's something that we discussed a little bit, I think, when we were reading the technology book, how artificial intelligence fits into Simoneau's thought, and he in that book he I mean, of course, he's writing in the 60s, so it's a completely different context in terms of computation. But he dismisses the idea of thinking machines. He argues that thinking in the proper sense, it can only be carried out by a living being, and that whatever calculations that computers can do will never have that same property of being able to carry out an individuation process that is essentially part of what it is to be a living being. But I think, yeah, I think the boundary between living and living beings and technical objects is probably less clear than it was when Simoneau was writing in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, so the notion of the quantum, or when he uses the word quantic in French, quantique, but I think he's using it as a synonym for discrete because precisely of that property that you quoted there, Alyosha, the fact that the energy states of an electron in an atom can only take on certain discrete values. They can't take on continuous values across. They can't take on values across a continuum. There's only discrete states that they can take on. And so in the same way he's talking about the process of physical individuation is something, it's a all or nothing instantaneous operation. So there's his example that we're going to get to in the first chapter is the brick. The brick is formed once, and then after that, the individual brick, it can only degrade. Individuation can only degrade. It can wear away or something like that. Whereas in living beings, the individuation process is ongoing throughout the individual's life. So it's not. There is. So he says there is a certain aspect there is a certain absolute individuation to an individual, living individual. There's a certain discreteness to that individual. But what it is to be a living individual is to maintain that constant process of individuation throughout a lifespan, which is and so that's the sense in which the living individual is always contemporary with itself, as opposed to the physical individuation process, like the crystal, which has the interior, as he puts it, the topologically interior is genetically anterior. So the already crystallized portion of the crystal is already it's a product of a process of individuation, which is not itself undergoing individuation anymore, and so it's radically past in that sense, whereas the living individual is contemporary with itself because it's always undergoing the process of individuation.
Incidentally, if no one's seen, I was curious about the supersaturated liquid example because I didn't really know it before Simone did. And I was watching videos the other day, and not only like you can introduce something into the liquid, and obviously that initiates the crystallization, but you can also, if you do it right, you can just you can have a water bottle filled with supersaturated, supercooled liquid, and if you just shake it, the crystallization will take place. And so it's just another nice visual kind of way of, it's a metaphor and a way of visualizing it with the water bottle, because it's not quite as exact as what he's saying. But if you look at it, it is instantaneous. Like you shake it and it happens almost all at once, which is really interesting to me. It fits with what he's saying. But I just wanted to mention that.
I think, I have a fairly limited knowledge about crystals, but as far as I understand, it also depends on some of the parameters of the whole system, like what chemicals and what temperature and pressure and so on that the whole system is at, because some processes of crystallization will be more gradual as well, but it's still so the crystallization of the whole system takes time, but each sort of layer of that crystallization process or the crystallization that's happening at the limit is instantaneous. It goes from a liquid state to a crystallized state instantaneously, and then the previously crystallized portion of the system is no longer capable of transformation. Yeah, the notion of the seed is a bit of a difficult point, I think, in Simondon's theory, because we saw this in the form information potentials discussion.
So you want
where
to see
he doesn't. In his theory, we can't sort of just allow for the seed of the crystallization process to come from outside, because then the seed is already an individual, which is the source of the individuation process, and then we have the same problem as on the atomistic or hylomorphic theories. But then he also the sort of alternative hypothesis is that there's some sort of randomness to the process, or there's a role of chance to the formation of the crystals in the solution. And he mentions that hypothesis, but then he says something like it's hard to admit that, or it's hard to accept that chance would play that role. Or, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but he seemed hesitant to grant chance or probability this sort of determining role of setting off the process of individuation. So I think that seed, the notion of the seed or the initial formation of the process of individuation is a bit of a difficult point on his theory that he doesn't have a good account for, or that he tries to he doesn't like the idea that it's purely a chance operation, or that there's the role of chance in that operation.
And 2 points that really stand out to me are that he's emphasizing this difference between physical individuation or the physical individual and the living individual that has not a radically past, so to speak. So it has this notion of duration from, or better, of memory in Bergson, and this on the second. The second point that is interesting for me is that he's in the last sentence of this paragraph saying it is a system within a system, involving within itself a mediation between two orders of magnitude. So we have this constant intensity, so to speak, between two different levels, and this transformation or this as he calls it, mediation between two levels of information. And by that we not only have homeostatic system in the sense that it is reflective, so it relates some criteria or some parameter back to the state of its system, but it is in some sort of sense pre-reflexive, but in a more not in a pure logical sense, but also on a physical level, almost, because it is always relating back to its own structure and restructuring this structure on another level. So we have this not reflective but a reflexive motion.
Yeah, and that's something that I've pointed out a couple of times. These reflexive verbs that so in French you can use reflexive verbs where in English we would just use a passive or an intransitive verb. But I think in some cases it would be worth translating them as a reflexive, just precisely to convey the reflexivity of the process. So it's a system individuating itself. It's just a system undergoing a process of individuation. A living being is itself the agent of its individuation rather than just a product of individuation. Oh, and I'll just also note in passing that footnote 9 there is the one that has the example of the plant integrating the cosmic order of magnitude in solar energy and the molecular level or order of magnitude within the cell. So that's I think a really nice example of what he means by the mediating role of the individual. But yeah, I don't like the way in the translation the footnotes are changed into endnotes, which makes it harder to check them, I think. But that's okay. It's just my preference.
Yeah, I really prefer footnotes in the text as well, because then you don't have this back and forth and you don't get as much interrupted.
Yeah, they also changed the numbering of the footnotes for whatever reason. So, like footnote 9 in the English is footnote 5 in French. I'm not sure why there's 4 more footnotes.
Maybe there are some notes by the translator, and they use the same system of just numbers for it. Sometimes in other editions it's just a star and then on the end of the page, but I didn't see this in this edition yet.
Yeah, that would be my guess. There's probably translators' footnotes as well, but I haven't taken a look at that at the or translators' endnotes. I guess they would be. I haven't looked at the endnotes yet. Yeah, I guess we can go on to the next paragraph. Maybe I'll read this one. Indeed, a hypothesis can be made that is analogous to the hypothesis of quanta in physics and also to the hypothesis of the relativity of levels of potential energy. It can be supposed that individuation does not fully exhaust pre-individual reality, and that a regime of metastability is not merely sustained by the individual but carried by it, such that the constituted individual transports along with it a certain associated charge of pre-individual reality that is animated by all the potentials which characterize it. An individuation is relative, like a structural change in a physical system. A certain level of potential remains, and further individuations are still possible. This pre-individual nature, which remains associated with the individual, is a source of future metastable states, from whence new individuations will be able to emerge. According to this hypothesis, it will be possible to consider every veritable relation as having the status of being and as developing from within a new individuation. Relation which does not spring forth between two terms that would already be individuals. Relation is an aspect of the internal resonance of a system of individuation. It belongs to a system state. This living being, which is both more and less than unity, conveys an interior problematic and can enter as an element into a problematic that is vaster than its own being. For the individual, participation is the fact of being an element in a vaster individuation through the intermediary of the charge of pre-individual reality that the individual contains, i.e. due to the potentials that it harbors. So Alyosha posted in the chat the passage from the form information potentials discussion section that we saw a couple weeks ago, where Simondon sort of brings up this notion of chance, but then sort of rejects it at the same time. So that would be something worth digging into more if someone's looking for a paper topic or something like that. That would be an interesting one to look at.
Oh yes, definitely. But somehow I get here some anti-Oedipus vibes in relation to the body without organs. Or is it just me, or I just have this vague feeling now? But still, the BWO is still a bit of a puzzling concept. But for me, it sounds a little bit like there is this unstructured or better pre-individual immanent plane that is then partially formed by desiring machines, and they are still struggling in this intermediary process.
I think you're spot on. I mean, having read this, it makes, I feel like what the D&G were doing with, or what Deleuze is doing specifically with the body without organs, is a straight adaptation of these concepts. And it actually helps in the Muriel Combs I was reading earlier. She talks about, if you think about the concept of phase shifting that we will get to, but that Simondon uses a lot, one of the important things is that that concept sounds chronological, so you think of, well, what does it mean to be prior to phasing, and what happens once things start to phase shift? But she brings up the example of, the way it's discussed in thermodynamics and in other kinds of scientific discussions, where phases are literally like the states of, so liquid is a phase, gas is a phase, so and how whenever a process of transduction is happening, there's always two subsystems that are being brought to bear upon each other, and not necessarily canceling each other out, but now, producing this whole individuating process, I guess. And so when you think about it that way, it really fits with the way Deleuze, D&G talk about, when you think, whenever they talk about, the schizo going around the circle, they talk about going through the intensities, and it's very, when you read it on its own, it's very hard to understand, what is this traversing the egg? Like, what are they talking about? Like, what does this even mean? But I think it makes so much more sense when you put it in the light of this idea of like a transductive unity that is producing, I think the language they use in Anti-Oedipus is the subject is the part, what's the word? The separate piece, or there's a word that they use that means it's one piece. The subject is the sort of produced result on the side, but that doesn't, the BWO is still always there. And the cycling through the intensities never stops necessarily. And yeah, I think you're right that it's a direct influence on that. Separate part, that's the word I think they use, the subject, the separate part.
All right. I think we can go on to the next one. It's a bit of a long paragraph, but someone else would like to read it.
It then becomes possible to think the relation interior and exterior to the individual as participation without invoking new substances. The psyche and the collective are constituted by individuations that come after vital individuation. The psyche continues vital individuation in a being that, in order to resolve its own problematic, is itself forced to intervene as an element of the problem through its action as subject. The subject can be conceived as the unity of the being qua individuated living being, and qua being that is the representative of its action through the world as an element and dimension of the world. Vital problems are not self-enclosed. Their open axiomatic can only be saturated by an indefinite sequence of successive individuations that always engage more pre-individual reality and incorporated in the relation to the milieu. Affectivity and perception are integrated in emotion and in science, both of which suppose a recourse to new dimensions. However, the psychical being cannot resolve its own problematic in itself. Its charge of pre-individual reality at the same time as it is individuating as a psychical being that surpasses the limits of the individuated being and incorporates the living being in a system of the world and the subject, makes participation possible as a condition of the individuation of the collective. Insofar as it is collective, individuation turns the individual into a group individual that is associated with the group through the pre-individual reality that the individual bears. A pre-individual reality that, paired with the pre-individual reality of other individuals, individuates into a collective unit. Collective and psychical individuations are both reciprocal with respect to one another. They make it possible to define a category of the trans-individual, which attempts to account for the systematic unity of interior psychical individuation and exterior collective individuation. The psychosocial world of the trans-individual is neither the brute social order nor the inter-individual. It supposes a veritable operation of individuation on the basis of a pre-individual reality that is associated with individuals and is able to constitute a new problematic which has its own metastability. It expresses a quantum condition that is correlative with a plurality of orders of magnitude. The living being is presented as a problematic being, both superior and inferior to unity. To call the living being problematic is to consider becoming as a dimension of the living being. The living being exists according to becoming, which operates a mediation. The living being is an agent and theater of individuation. Its becoming is an ongoing individuation, or rather a sequence of the manifestation of individuation, advancing from metastability to metastability. Thus the individual is neither substance nor a simple part of the collective. The collective intervenes as a resolution of the individual problematic, and this means that the basis of collective reality is already partially contained within the individual as the pre-individual reality that remains associated with the individuated reality. What is generally considered as relation, due to the improper hypothesis of the substantialization of individual reality, is in fact a dimension of individuation through which the individual becomes. Relation to the world and to the collective is a dimension of individuation in which the individual participates based on pre-individual reality, which progressively individuates.
So this bit is a sort of a preview of the second part of the book, which again we won't get to for weeks or months. The portion on psychic individuation and then collective individuation, but some of the notions that we can sort of look at already. This notion of a dimension. So it's a little bit obscure in this portion, but it becomes clearer, I believe, later in the introduction, where he introduces the example of binocular vision. And so you have a disparation between the two images. Each eye receives a slightly different retinal image, but the individuation process incorporates those two retinal images. It doesn't just sort of preserve what is common. It's not a process of abstraction that only preserves what's common to the two images, but it incorporates the disparation between the images, and in doing so, it provides for depth vision. So it introduces a new dimension into the system. And he takes this example as a sort of paradigm for other processes of individuation. So there's this mediating role that introduces a new dimension into the system. And yes, so Alyosha, as I mentioned in the chat here, this is connected to his criticism of induction. So in inductive thinking, you always lose content the more you abstract from the individual or from the given reality. So you take the two retinal images, and then you would abstract from their differences and preserve only what's common, but then you lose all of the content that is particular to one image as opposed to another. And the transductive thinking is supposed to not lose the content in the same way, but to incorporate that content into the mediation that results from the creation of this new dimension. And so this new dimension is a resolution of a problem. So that's where this notion of problematic comes up here in this paragraph. So there's the problematic that is the disparation of the retinal images, and then there's a resolution of that problem through the creation of a new dimension through the depth perception. Yeah, and so with that last comment there, Alyosha, this calls to mind as well from the technical object on the mode of existence of technical objects book. He criticizes the use of or the classificatory approach towards understanding technical objects, so classifying them into genus and species, because he thinks that. So he gives examples like if you classify objects as clocks, for example, then you'll have mechanical clocks and electric clocks classified in the same family. Even though their fundamental principles of operation are completely different, and a mechanical clock is closer to a crossbow than it is to an electric clock in terms of the actual functioning of the object itself. So this criticism of induction and the criticism of this classification into genus and species are coordinate concepts, and so he. So it's like the Borges story with the weird the supposed Chinese encyclopedia with the categorization of different objects. So we can go on to the next paragraph, which is also a long one. If someone else would like to read.
Thus, psychology and the theory of the collective are tied together. Ontogenesis is that which indicates what participation in the collective is, as well as what the physical operation conceived as the resolution of a problematic is. The individuation that is life is conceived as the discovery in a conflictual situation of a new axiomatic that incorporates and unifies all the elements of the situation into a system that contains the individual. In order to understand what the physical activity at the heart of the theory of individuation as a resolution of the conflictual nature of the metastable state is, the veritable ways in which metastable systems become established in life must be discovered. In this sense, both the notion of the individual's adaptive relation to the milieu and the critical notion of the knowing subject's relation to the object known must be modified. Knowledge is not constructed abstractly on the basis of sensation, but problematically on the basis of an initial tropistic and taxic unity, which is the coupling of tropism and sensation, an orientation of the living being in a polarized world. Even here it is necessary to detach ourselves from the hylomorphic schema. There is not a sensation that would be a matter constituting an a posteriori, given for the a priori forms of sensibility. A priori forms are an initial resolution by the discovery of the axiomatic of tensions resulting from the encounter of primitive tropistic and taxic unities. The a priori forms of sensibility are neither a prioris nor a posteriores, obtained via abstraction, but the structures of an axiomatic that appears in an operation of individuation. In the tropistic and taxic unity, there is already the world and a living being, but the world merely appears there as a direction, as the polarity of a gradient that situates the individuated being in an indefinite dyad, the median point of which it occupies and which extends out from it. Perception and then science continue to resolve this problematic, not just through the invention of spatiotemporal frameworks, but through the constitution of the notion of the object, which becomes the source of the initial gradients and organizes them according to a world. The distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori, a byproduct of the hylomorphic schema in the theory of knowledge, obfuscates in its dark zone the veritable operation of individuation, which is the center of knowledge. The very notion of qualitative or intensive series should be thought according to the theory of phases of being. It is not relational and subtended by a pre-existence of extreme terms, but develops on the basis of an initial intermediate state that localizes the living being and inserts it into the gradient that gives a directionality to the tropistic and taxic unity. The series is an abstract vision of the direction according to which the tropistic unity is oriented. We must start with individuation, with the being grasped in its center according to spatiality and becoming, and not with a substantialized individual facing a world that is foreign to it.
Yeah, could someone post the next footnote? I think it should be footnote 11 at the end of that paragraph, because that's where he introduces this term presenti, which I mentioned, I think, last time. So that's a helpful footnote. But yeah, so there were some questions in the chat about this notion of tropism or the tropistic unity. And there's a strange translation choice here where he says tropistic and taxic unity. But in the French, it just says tropistic. I'm not sure where he got this taxic from. So I don't know what the deal is with that. But so this is, again, this is sort of previewing the psychic individuation portion of the book. But tropism it has to do with behavior of organisms that is oriented. You have bacteria that will swim or move up a sugar concentration gradient in a solution, for example. So they will swim towards the portion of the solution that has more sugar and move away from the portion that has less sugar. And then you have phototropism, so orientation towards light. So you can have, there are like sunflowers, of course, that will turn to follow the sun and orient themselves towards light. And then you have negative phototropism in some insects, for example, that will run away from light and hide in dark areas. And yeah, so you can have tropisms related to pretty much any property of the environment, but it's a behavior of an organism to orient itself with respect to some sort of gradient in the environment. And so Simondon here, he's borrowing this notion of tropism, and so he argues that this is more fundamental. Tropism is more fundamental than something like sensation, which would be a sort of a purely receptive capacity in a psychic individual or in a living being, insofar as it has a psyche. So rather than having so the notion of sensation as matter, which would be formed through he qualifies this as being a consequence of the hylomorphic schema applied to knowledge. So matter and form appear in knowledge as sensation and concepts. But then, so and then this matter and form distinction corresponds to the a posteriori and a priori distinction. And then, so he's arguing that this tropism, or this more fundamental level of the tropistic, is neither a priori nor a posteriori, but a presenti. So it's not something that's prior to the experience, to the interaction between the subject and what it knows. But it's a process of individuation that happens in that interaction between the knowing subject and the object known.
Can I ask then, is the idea then that, like, I might just be restating what you're saying, I'm just trying to understand. So like in this critique of the kind of Kantian idea, then, for example, something like sensibility, the problem which Simonon is identifying is that if you start from this idea of like a psyche that somehow precedes, or like, I think there's a quote in the Combs where she talks about the operation of individuation does not admit of an already constituted observer. That's kind of where I'm starting from in this thought of, like, it's like you're retrojecting this psyche as the transcendental subject or whatever, and that by using the idea of tropism, does that link it to the idea of information again, so that rather than thinking, okay, well, there's this individual like a psyche or a mind interacting with this thing that's external to it, and then you have sensations, and that is the typical idea of information, of like you are receiving some kind of sense data and then you are interpreting it, and this is how you know the world. That with the idea of tropism, there's like a directionality to it, which, again, I'm thinking out loud here. Does that connect it then back to Simonon's idea of information as something that is directional and as the expression of this larger process of ontogenesis in a metastable system, which would mean that the thing feeling the sensation and the thing giving out whatever that we think of as the sense data, it's like the individual milieu thing of, like, they could be both products of the same potential, ontogenetic or individuative, process, that only after the fact, because I think he says thought itself is like a process of a product of individuation, rather than something that can precede it. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but is this what he's getting at? That whole scenario, that a Kantian kind of approach, or any kind of transcendental approach, that then kind of is very suspicious of sense and intuition and all those things, which I think people like Bergson are really preoccupied with. Like, it's kind of already based on this false problem that goes back to this thing of information and whatnot.
I'm not sure if it's, I don't think it's directly connected to the problematic about information, but might be able to make that connection in along the lines that you sort of sketched out. But I think the more direct criticism is that the Kantian approach of understanding experience as having these two components, the matter and the form, or the sensation and the concepts, that approach, it has the same problem as the hylomorphic theory of individuation in general, because it's just an application of that hylomorphic schema to knowledge. So there's the form and matter interaction is not accounted for in that theory. So there's this dark zone, the intermediate point between matter and form. Somehow the matter and form are supposed to interact with each other, but we're never given an explanation of how that's supposed to happen. And so So the general criticism is that dark zone, the fact that it leaves this dark zone, so that the interaction is never accounted for. And then, so what this notion of tropism allows for instead is, rather than leaving that dark zone or leaving that intermediate level dark or obscure, there's you start from that intermediate zone. So the tropism is as an organism undergoes or carries out this tropism, it situates itself at an intermediate level in that gradient. So though it understands or it experiences the world as structured into a more and a less, this indefinite dyad. So that can be more light versus less light, or more sugar versus less sugar, whatever it is. But the organism situates itself at that intermediate level or in that middle zone, and then the world around it is structured in terms of more and less around that middle. So this notion of tropism allows us to avoid leaving that intermediate zone dark or obscure.
Yeah, I think it's great how the coupling of tropism and then sensation, together, that mediation really also deals with like ideas around like instinct. I think it, reframes all that as that problematic, or that mediation and the decision or like the sensing. I think there's a lot in this sentence that is pretty interesting. And it's reminding me also of Eduardo Cohn's work, which he hadn't read Simondon because I don't think this was available, but How Forests Think, and how amazing. I think there's a lot of similarities, I think, in what Cohn is trying to do, and I think this would have been really helpful.
Huh.
Yeah, that was helpful, both of you. I guess what I was thinking in my mind, and I'll have to keep thinking through, is that's kind of why I thought it's related back to the information thing, because then in that point, information is literally, it's a form taking. It's tropistic, and it's I think we talked about last time the surface and depth thing, that information isn't a data point that is exchanged between emitter and receiver, but it's itself the expression of a problematic being resolved, I guess. And so under that light, then you can start talking about individual milieu, like, the milieu being robbed of the individual, all these things, as you talk about the information, I guess, emerging, rather than the information kind of being how we think of it in like computer science or something, or in maths in an abstract sense of like that it just kind of exists a priori, and we're just discovering it and finding where it is. That was kind of where I was going in my head, and because taxic and tropic, I don't know these words like people in chat were talking about. So looking at them, the idea of directionality seems to link with what he's trying to get at, that there is a unfolding and like a generative process that's happening. And that's why he's looking for language that evokes that idea of movement and continuity might be the wrong word, but of continual individuation rather than simple kind of like static states or forms or something.
Yeah, it's interesting how I think information and like the notion one has of information becomes really central to both Simondon's work, and then and it's amazing how just the way one thinks of what information is really then goes on to just kind of constitute this worldview one has. Another theorist that deals with information in an interesting way, I think that is very related to Simondon, is Gregory Bateson's notion that information is a difference that makes a difference. So rather than the Shannon information being, information that is about communication across the channel, it's instead information that depends on like something that makes a difference for like a being that recognizes it. And I think Simondon falls in that, it's very much, he mentions Shannon information in here too, I think, at some point. And that, it's, that his notion of information is very, very different than how it's constituted or how it's conceived in like information theory.
The way he explains it in the form, information, and potentials discussion that we read a while ago, he characterizes Shannon information as having to do with the transmission of information, but not accounting for the generation of that information in the first place. So once you have information, you can transmit it, and the process of transmission can be characterized by the quantity of information in the Shannon sense. But then there's something that pre-exists that transmission process. There's the generation of the tension of information, as he calls it, which is prior to the transmission.
Transfer back and forth is overplayed.
So I think we have time to read probably the next two short paragraphs, if someone else would like to read.
The same method can be employed to explore affectivity and emotivity, which constitute the resonance of the being with respect to itself and connect the individuated being back to the pre-individual reality that is associated with it. Just as tropistic and taxic unity in perception link it to the milieu. The psyche consists of successive individuations that allow for the being to resolve the problematic states corresponding to the ongoing establishment of communication of that which is larger than it and that which is smaller than it. But the psyche cannot be resolved to the level of the individuated being alone. It is the basis of participation in a vaster individuation, that of the collective, calling itself into question. The individual being alone cannot go beyond the limits of anxiety, which is an operation without action, an ongoing emotion that does not manage to resolve affectivity, an obstacle through which the individuated being explores its dimensions of being without the ability to surpass them. The notion of the transindividual corresponds to the collective taken as the axiomatic that resolves the psychical problematic.
So again, this is previewing stuff we won't see for a while until we get to the part on psychic individuation. So he again wants to characterize, or he wants to reframe the ideas of affectivity and emotivity, rather than taking affectivity as something that that comes about after an experience or a relation to the world. We want to characterize affectivity as something that has to do with the incorporation of the individual into the world. So it's in the example of anxiety. Anxiety is the sort of failure of that process of individuation, or the dead end that process of individuation runs into, and that's what's going to push beyond psychic individuation to collective individuation. So it's anxiety is the emotion of the individual of the psychic individual that isn't capable of resolving its relation, its incorporation into the world. And then, Alyosha mentioned, is this a response to existentialism? I think it probably is. Simondon never cites things, unfortunately, or almost never cites what he's actually referring to, which is kind of annoying. But I think there's a good chance that he's thinking of Sartre as his idea of what or his reference point for anxiety. I'm not sure 100% because again he doesn't cite it. So I think we have time to read actually the next paragraph as well, which let's see. I guess I'll read it. Such a set of reforms of notions is supported by the hypothesis that an information is never relative to a single and homogeneous reality, but to two orders in a state of disparation. Information, whether this be at the level of tropistic unity or at the level of the transindividual, is never deposited in a form that is able to be given. It is the tension between two disparate reals. It is the signification that will emerge when an operation of individuation will discover the dimension, according to which two disparate reals can become a system. Information is therefore an initiation of individuation, a requirement for individuation. For the passage from the metastable to the stable, it is never a given thing. There is no unity and identity of information, for information is not a term. It supposes the tension of a system of being in order for it to be adequately received. It can only be inherent to a problematic. Information is that through which the non-resolved system's incompatibility becomes an organizational dimension in the resolution. Information supposes a phase change of a system, for it supposes a first pre-individual state that individuates according to the discovered organization. Information is the formula of individuation, a formula that cannot exist before this individuation. It could be said that information is always in the present, actual, for it is the direction according to which a system individuates. And then in the footnote, he mentioned that he's not rejecting the notion of quantity of information transmitted, but he's referring to what is more fundamental, the first information, or you could say primary information, which underlies the kind of information that can be transmitted. And so that term disparation, again, goes back to the example of binocular vision, where the two images are disparate, they're different from each other, but they're incorporated into the discovery of the new dimension in depth perception, rather than the differences being eliminated.
There's actually a whole field of biology right now that's like looking at this concept of information, but through others later, like that were in English, like Gregory Bateson's like notion of the difference that makes a difference. But it's called biosemiotics, so it's about the mediation of information between beings, and like looking at life as not like something that you define as like a chemical process, or but actually as like a communicative process.
Yeah, biosemiotics is something that I know very little about, but I know enough to know that it's that there's like interesting stuff, but that's about it.
I just have a question, since I don't know about it either. When you say communication, Sol, do you mean like sort of like using like dialogic or like that kind of theory, or do you mean how does it kind of work?
Sure. Well, I guess more semiosis is the term, rather. So just looking at Peirce's, it focuses more on like Peirce's semiotics, and using those to then think about like animal communication, or plant communication, or just like how this sort of like, I think getting at a lot of what Simondon is getting at too, and so it's just this. I don't know enough about it, but there's a few people. There's like Terence Deacon, who's also a theorist, that has done some work on biosemiotics. He has a recent book on the absential, and Jasper Hoffmeyer. Hoffmeyer is a pretty
Jasper Hoffmeyer, yes.
Yeah. Is a pretty big theorist in this field. So they're probably a good introductory theorists to look at.
I will send some PDFs here, because I have a whole folder on biosemiotics, if someone is interested in it. And I guess the best introduction is still by Jasper Hoffmeyer. He has a whole book that's just called Biosemiotics. I hope I can find it soon. And yeah, it's this especially big string of semiotics that has evolved in the last decades in Denmark and in the upper Scandinavian countries. There's also a whole semiotic and pragmatistic society in Helsinki, where they are holding regularly a Perth conference and so on. So there's a lot of stuff going on between the field of semiotics and physiology, biology, but also chemistry, because there are sub-disciplines like endosemiotics that are looking at the specific communicative processes within enzymes, with enzymes and in the brain, or also the communication between cells. And there's also something like eco-semiotics, how different organisms are communicating with each other through different signals and hormones. Like in a forest, there's this whole communicative system between trees, fungi, and animals. So it's a pretty fascinating new strain of semiotics.
Yeah, and there's even, if I remember correctly, you can characterize the translation from DNA into proteins as a semiotic process, because there's the coding of the nucleides, so that they produce different enzymes through this coding system, and so you can look at DNA and RNA as part of a semiotic process as well. But I think we're just about at time, so that was, yeah, I'm gonna have to look into more of this about biosemiotics, because it's something that I know only vaguely. So thanks everyone for participating, for your contributions, and see you all next week.